blesses with your blessing.
Say here again to the yeah. Oh, that's right.
Okay, this is the same tune, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now what I have down there is let the organ introduce it.
Right.
And then you kind of play the verse 2 pretty much by yourself. I'm just going to use some light celeste strings in the background.
Okay.
Then I'm going to two lines. Okay. I'll put an interlude. I'm not going to change keys though. I'll put an interlude between the second and third verse, and then we'll just kind of both go at it.
Okay.
Full force of that.
Okay.
Let's see.
What about this one on 547?
547. Okay, that's the meditative music. I don't have anything down for that. Let's see, this quiet rest. I'm thinking. Something with that you could. I have I'm going to solo chimes for the first verse, and then I'm just going to kind of improvise it. That's such a short one though. Yeah, I don't know. Let me just do it.
Okay.
You do the doxology.
And then this one, Jesus, our joy of loving hearts.
Okay. Well, I do think keys with that. Well, I definitely want you to do that. If you want to do all of this one on the meditative, there is a place that will quite rest. You want to do that all by yourself? Okay, all right. Let's just assign that to the piano. Okay, I think we got it. It's a joy. I hope you had fun last week. Guess Mildred played the prelude. Did you play the prelude?
Yeah, she played Beethoven's Pathetique.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Well, I know where it works. I had my foot sitting on the pedal.
And now I dropped a couple books on the keyboard.
Oh, the organ is tuned now. And so we're close. We're not perfect yet. So I'm going to email Bob Donner this afternoon.
Okay.
And see how fast I'm getting up here. I think it's going to be much better. But anyway, it's not perfect, and I think it's now the piano that needs to be tuned.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll work something out. That's a short one. So I was going to play one verse, and then I was going to kind of improvise the final line. So just repeat the last line extra slow or an octave higher if you want to. Yeah, the one after the sun. I kind of try to do a little bit more with that. I'm going to change keys on that. So yeah, I'll take care of that. And I'm going to try to get in touch with Ralph Willard this week. And he wants to practice, so I'll work with him on that. I want to run that by Michelle Bartlett. Maybe right now. Okay,
Morning. As you can see, oh wow, it's weird in here. As you can see, I'm not Pastor Michelle. She has a fever, and she said, I still have my sense of taste and smell, so she's not overly worried, and she's not completely knocked down by whatever this is, but she also said, I am not frolicking either. So she decided out of a sense of caution to stay home, and she has sent us a video meditation, so we will be viewing that later. The only other announcement I have is that the Wednesday groups, the Bible study and the book study, will not be meeting this week because the coaching team is meeting then. So unless anyone else has any announcements? No? Then let us prepare our hearts and minds for worship as we listen to Bud's prelude.
morning. Would you please follow along in the call to worship? Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless God's holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget all God's benefits, who forgives us all our iniquity, who heals all our diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed with the eagles. Please join me in our opening prayer. Our God, through you, our God, with all the influences and statuses that the name implies, you refuse to pull away and parade your power among us. Instead, you choose to step into our experiences, living among us, all as one of us, with all the struggles and suffering that goes with being human. More than that, you adopted the role of servant, washing feet, serving people of no reputation or social standing, and giving yourself Lord Christ, you declare, blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. You instruct us to forgive 77 times, to remember God's grace toward us, and extend it to one another. Despite your clear word to refrain from judging others, we pronounce others guilty and unworthy of our compassion. We quarrel over opinions and sow division. When you call us to cultivate relationships and demonstrate our unity in Christ, instead of responding to your grace with gratitude, we attempt to limit the love you command us to share. Forgive our hard-heartedness, expand our circles of concern, and live in our meetings of boundary-breaking, reconciling spirit. Amen. Please join me in the assurance of forgiveness. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is the Lord's steadfast love toward those who fear God. As far as the east is from the west, so far the Lord remains our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion for his children, so the God has compassion for those who fear the Lord. Friends, believe the good news, through Jesus Christ we are forgiven. Please follow along with prayer for illumination. Lord, we come to this time overwhelmed with distractions, consumed by busyness, occupied by worries, and unsure of what to do next. And yet we are here, yearning for a word from you, wanting a sense of your presence, seeking your wisdom for this time and place. Send your Spirit to focus our attention and hone our hearing in order that we might hear what you are saying to your church. Amen. Our psalm reading today is from Psalm chapter 103, verses 1 through 13. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and do not forget all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity, who heals all your diseases, who redeems your life from the pit, who crowns you with steadfast love and mercy, who satisfies you with good as long as you live, so that your youth is renewed like the eagles. The Lord works in vindication and justice for all who oppressed. He made known his ways to Moses. He acts to the people of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. He will not always accuse, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as the heavens are high above the earth, so great is his steadfast love toward those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far he removes our transgressions from us. As a father has compassion for children, so the Lord has compassion for those who fear him. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our Old Testament reading today is from Genesis chapter 50, 15 through 21. Realizing that their father was dead, Joseph's brothers said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him?" So they approached Joseph, saying, "Your father gave this instruction before he died. Say to Joseph, 'I beg you, forgive the crime of your brothers and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of the servants of the God of your father.'" Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also wept, fell down before him, and said, "We are here as your slaves." But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. I am in place of God. Even though you intended to do harm to me, God intended for it for good in order to preserve a numerous people, as he is doing today. So have no fear. I myself will provide for you and your little ones." In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Our New Testament reading is from Romans chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. Welcome those who are weak in faith, but not for the purpose of quarreling over opinions. Some believe in eating anything, while the weak eat only vegetables. Those who eat must not despise those who abstain, and those who abstain must not pass judgment on those who eat, for God has welcomed them. Who are you to pass judgment on servants of another? It is before their own Lord that they stand or fall, and they will be upheld, for the Lord is able to make them stand. Some judge one day to be better than another, while others judge all days to be alike. Let all be fully convinced in their own minds. Those who observe the day, observe it in honor of the Lord. Also those who eat, eat in honor of the Lord, since they give thanks to God, while those who abstain, abstain in honor of the Lord and give thanks to God. We do not live to ourselves, and we do not die to ourselves. If we live to the Lord, and if we die to the Lord. So then, whether we live or whether we die, we are the Lord's. For to this end Christ died and lived again, so that he might be Lord of both the dead and the living. Why do you pass judgment on your brother or sister? Or you, why do you despise your brother or sister? For we will all stand before the judgment seat of God. For it is written, "As I live, says the Lord, every knee shall bow to me, and every tongue shall give praise to God." So then, each of us will be accountable to God. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Our gospel reading is from Matthew chapter 18, verses 21 through 35. Then Peter came and said to him, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you, 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. So the slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay what you owe.' Then his fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. Then he went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their lord all that had taken place. Then his lord summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger, his lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning, everyone. By now you know that I'm not with you just to be extra cautious with regard to everybody's health. And I have a few thoughts to share with you this morning about the passage in front of us. You've heard the reading from Romans, where Paul is writing about looking out for one another and including one another, rather than demanding that everybody be on your side or the other. There's no having to choose here, but to hold one another together in love. And you've heard the passage from Matthew 18 for today. It's a passage that follows on our passage from last week, from learning about listening to one another in such a way that others are heard, just like we long to be heard by others, and how this brings us together rather than drives us apart. When we refuse to listen, we're essentially writing off somebody else. If they refuse to listen, it's like they're writing us off as well. So community depends on this, not on agreement, but on listening to one another, as Jesus is explaining it. Listen comes up so many times in those first few verses. Last week we observed that the servant in today's passage didn't listen very well either. As a matter of fact, it's pretty clear that this servant also turns his back on community by refusing to listen, by refusing to take in what his master did for him in forgiving his debt. But there's another interesting dimension, because what that master did in the interest of the welfare of the servant and the welfare of the household overall, as we understand things at the time, what that master did was to hold things together, was to allow healing to come in. He was willing and able to let go of some things for the sake of this servant of his. The servant then goes on as though none of that happened, as though his debt wasn't forgiven, as though his master hadn't been kind and compassionate to him, as though there was no connection between him and the household community. In a very real sense, he is very self-centered in this passage. His crying out for mercy turns out to be, just let me off the hook. And instead, the master says, you are forgiven of your debt. But then he turns around, this servant, to hold everybody else on the hook who owes him. He does not extend the same care and compassion and community that the master extended to him. It's really kind of shocking when we look at it, because it's so blatant, isn't it, in this passage, that what this servant is doing is the exact opposite of what the master just did. It's the exact opposite of what's in the passage right before. It's the exact opposite of those other passages towards the beginning of the chapter that we've also mentioned, especially, for instance, when Jesus talks about the shepherd who will leave the 99 in the fold and go off in search of the other to restore the whole flock. Here, there's no restoration, it's only destruction that we see. This servant does not have empathy. He does not enter into the experience and feelings of the master to understand how he was seeking to build up community, because he wasn't listening. He couldn't have empathy, because that empathy, that entering into and understanding another person's experience, is fundamental to community, isn't it? The people we've lived with in our households now or in years past, friends, neighbors, co-workers, the list goes on for our experiences of when we knew we had shared experiences in common. When we hold ourselves to be the center of everything, instead of acknowledging that others exist and that they matter, we do a different thing with the bonds of community. It's not like turning our back directly on those bonds, but it is ignoring those bonds in a particular way. And right now, everybody needs this empathy, right? We all need this empathy. We need this listening. We need this patience that we can have with one another. Ways we can manifest God's presence in the world in the way Jesus is calling us to. The love and forgiveness we have received in the household of God is what we are called to extend. And this can happen in a lot of different ways, we know. Sometimes it's not possible for us to forgive right away, but that doesn't mean we can't still exert empathy. It's not a matter of settling things immediately right now, but of keeping enough space between us, safe, that when forgiveness can happen, it happens, that we understand that the feelings of the other matter. We have a possibility for letting things go in order to retain one another. We can see plenty of examples for how we might consider doing that these days. There are lots of people across all the spectrums who are anxious or really wanting something in particular to happen or to happen like it used to. People on all sides are eager for things to be back the way they think they should be. And the point here in this passage is to let ourselves be that way, but also to keep one another in community, to have empathy for one another, knowing that each person is struggling in their own lives. There is an old saying, people attribute it to Plato or to others. The saying is, be kind to everyone, for everyone is fighting a battle you can't see. There's anxiety, grief, all sorts of things swirling around in us these days. Anger, all sorts of things throughout our country, throughout all the different situations. Racial protest, COVID, fires, Hurricane Laura, unemployment, the list goes on. But God is still in our midst. God is still loving us, and we remember that on the third day, he will be raised. This is not the end of the story, so we can afford to be a little bit more generous with others and with ourselves. So when you walk out the doors this week, it might be an opportunity to think in terms of these first three things we've learned. Patience, because we know what's happening right now isn't the definition of everything that is. Listening, which is how we acknowledge one another and open ourselves to the stories of others. And now empathy, doing what we do in order to maintain bonds of community because we recognize the experiences of the other person. We get an understanding of what their situation is, like the master, and extend them compassion for that. I hope you look for opportunities to do that for one another, even in the sanctuary right now where you are, at home, at work, in so many different ways. That you do it for strangers too, should you happen to run into them. But at the very least, just ponder it, just pray it. Just keep your eyes open for where God might be leading you to treat another human being with empathy. You might listen to them and be patient with them. Friends, to God alone be the glory, now and forever. Amen.
As we come to our time of prayer today, I have a few things that I want to remember, some joys and concerns. First of all, big joy, the marching band finally got to perform last night. That's McKenna, Oliver, Sam, and Evan, all in our marching band, and they had a great competition. Oh, and Craig! Sorry, Craig. And so they had a great competition, a great show, and I think it's going to be exciting. Community performance coming up in October, so if anyone wants to attend. We also want to keep Bess in our prayers. I believe she came home this week, so we keep her in our prayers and hope she is healing well. And third, I'd like to ask for prayers for all teachers all over the world, because we're all first-year teachers again, basically. So we're doing everything in all new ways, and we're learning and struggling, and so prayers for everyone. Let us come to God in a time of prayer. Almighty God, you alone are Lord of conscience. In life and death, we belong to you. Ultimately, we are accountable only to you. Trusting in your mercy, confident as your children, we come to you eager to be in your presence and receive your wisdom. When uncertainty swirls all around us, we rest in your peace. When the world feels threatening, we find solace in your compassion. When we are overwhelmed by the needs of the world, we remember your power to heal and bring wholeness in ways we could never imagine. When we fear we are alone, you promise never to abandon us. When we yearn to unburden our hearts, you assure us that you hear our sighs too deep for words. Merciful God, there is much on our minds this day. People still recovering from hurricanes and fires, communities reeling from racial injustice, families grieving the death of loved ones, students, parents, and teachers attempting to navigate a school year like no other. In all these places and with all your people, bring relief and offer encouragement. We suffer with those suffering from hunger, illness, and loneliness. We rejoice with those who rejoice at the birth of a baby or the beginning of a marriage. We give thanks for the care we receive from friends and the kindness shown to us by strangers. Make of us, we pray, reflections of your goodness and grace to those most in need of your mercy. Loving God, we seek only to be faithful in this season as in all seasons. Do not let us forget that you equip us to do your will. You surround us with others with whom to do the work you call us to do. You send your Spirit to give us the words, show us the way, and empower us to keep going when we are tempted to turn away from you. We hold fast to your promises in order that others might come to experience your love through us. Gracious God, we are bold to pray for those closest to us and even for ourselves. As we wrestle with what if and what now, we ask for a sure sense of your providence, even when we cannot yet perceive it. Grant us the wisdom to know the next thing we must do in order to follow you. Give us the courage to do that next thing with our whole heart and the faith to do it with joy. We make our prayer in the name of Lord Jesus Christ, who taught us to say when we pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory forever. Amen. As we go out from this place as God's own, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, and patience, forgiving each other as the Lord has forgiven you, and crown all these things with love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony. May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may abound in hope by the power of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.